When I think about federalism, I don't just mean, okay, let's let state and local governments tell you what to do instead of the federal government. What I mean is people should govern themselves at the most local level practicable, which typically is just individuals and families making decisions for themselves.
Hello. Welcome again to another episode in the Let Fuel Prosper series. My name is Dr. Vance, Ginn. I hope you're having a prosperous day. Well, today I'm delighted to have someone on that has been looking at Colorado's budget, Taxpayer's Bill of Rights, so much more with what's happening in Colorado and really across the country in a lot of ways. And it's none other than Ben Murrey. Ben, welcome to the Let Fuel Prosper show.
Hey, Vance, thanks so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to an opportunity to do this with you.
Yeah, same here, Ben. It's really a pleasure to have you on the program, and we're going to have a good discussion today. Today is October 11th, 2023 for the audience, just in case something happens between now and then, and this will be airing here soon. So we'll have a good discussion about Proposition HH, which is going on in Colorado and carrying a lot of buzz. And we'll have some other discussion about, you know, what should be improved on in Colorado and having a sustainable budget. So we've got a lot to discuss. Before we get too far into all that, though, let me go ahead and read off your bio for the audience, Ben, and then we'll jump right into it. So Ben Murrey serves as Independence Institute's Director of Fiscal Policy, working to promote fiscal responsibility in Colorado government and to defend the taxpayers' Bill of Rights in the state's constitution. That's the TABOR. Prior to his role with II, Ben spent 7 years as a United States Senate staffer in Washington, D.C., and a legislative aide for Senator Ted Cruz, Texas, which is also from Texas. So we'll get into some of that. While in Washington, D.C., he participated in numerous legislative and policy battles, including those over the 2014 effort to defund Obamacare, passage of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act in 2017, and passage of the CARES Act in 2020. He's a graduate of Hillsdale College with honors from both the politics and German departments. He did 2 stints as the exchange student in Germany, a native Texan. He finally put his money where his mouth was by moving with his wife and son to Denver and joining the Independent Institute staff. So he's a fantastic person overall. So we'll have a good discussion today. But Ben, before we get going too deep into this, though, let me ask you the question I do for every guest. Why do you do what you do each day?
You know what? When you said at the end of that bio there that I'm putting my money where my mouth was, when I was in D.C., I was always a champion of federalism. That was one of my big things I cared about. I was really passionate about as a staffer. You know, I always viewed it, if I was in D.C. and I worked myself out of a job, the federal government's power shrunk so much, and we did such a good job of returning the scope of federal power back to, you know, the original intent of the Constitution. If that meant that I lost my job and there was no work for me to do in DC anymore, then I will have succeeded. That's how that's what I said, right? And I went to work every day in DC with that kind of mindset. And eventually I said, you know what? If I believe so strongly in federalism, if I believe so strongly that more power should be in the hands of individuals and where applicable, state and local government, before we should be handing power over to the federal government. If I believe in federalism, why not move back to America, leave DC, move back to real America, and, you know, work on state policy. So that's what I decided to do. And you know, I have this passion for limited government, for individual freedom, and for federalism, for and when I think about federalism, Vance, I don't just mean, okay, well, let's let state and local governments tell you what to do instead of the federal government. What I mean is people should govern themselves at the most local level practicable, which typically is just individuals and families making decisions for themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yep. No, that's great. And I think that was the reason why you were like, hey, I need to move with my family and find, you know, move out of not real America up in Washington, D.C. in the swamp. We know what goes on there and how all that stuff happens, and actually make a difference in people's lives. And you've been doing that in Colorado, which is one reason why I wanted to have you on. And we've been talking about this for a long time, about the state budget and everything else. But I wanted to pick your brain a little bit, though, about your time in D.C. working for, you know, Texas Senator Ted Cruz and some of the battles that you saw while you were there. You know, what would you want to share from your time there?
Well, it was certainly fascinating. I didn't go to D.C. with the intent to be up there for 7 years. You know, I started my career in 2012 working for Ted Cruz's Senate campaign, and he was kind of this out of nowhere candidate. Everybody thought, you remember, the sitting lieutenant governor at the time, David Dewhurst, was just a shoo-in. There was no way anybody could beat him. And I worked for Ted, and I thought, well, you know, we'll see how it goes. I like this guy. And he won. And he brought me to D.C. with him. And I said at the time, well, I'm only going to stay here for a couple years because, what a great opportunity. And I don't want to pass that up, but I'll leave in a couple years. And then I was there for 7 years. Right. And,
Yeah.
It was interesting. It was an interesting experience working for this guy who rode the Tea Party wave to DC, ran for president and all that. One of my biggest observations, one of the biggest lessons I learned in DC, and this is something that I have to give credit to my old boss for, Ted Cruz, something he used to say a lot. I haven't heard him say it a lot recently, but he used to say this a lot. So, the biggest divide in America is not between Democrats and Republicans. The biggest divide in America is between career politicians in Washington, D.C. and the American people. And I just saw that time and time again when I was in D.C. And now my observation is that there really aren't a lot of folks on either side of the aisle who are really fighting for the American people. I think there are more Republicans doing it than there are Democrats. And I think the Democrats who are truly principled are the ones who are radical socialists, the Bernie Sanders and the Elizabeth Warrens of the world. I think they actually believe in what they're doing and they're truly trying to fight for their constituents. And, I just vehemently disagree with their approach.
Right.
On the Republican side, I think there are a few more. You see folks like Rand Paul and Ted Cruz and Mike Lee in the U.S. Senate who are willing to buck the establishment and buck the uniparty, if you will, to fight for the American people. But you just don't see a lot of politicians on either side of the aisle. And it really struck me when I was in D.C. how stark that is. Yeah.
No, that's great. And, by reading your bio, you got to be on some of the key issues that have been talked about over the last decade. I mean, whether it was repealing Obamacare or the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act or the CARES Act, and everything that was going on during 2020 and the shutdowns. And man, that was just a wild time. And, I happened to be up there too in DC when I was chief economist of the Office of Management and Budget. And there was just so much that was moving so fast and so quick. And that was really my only time for about a year of being in DC. So when you saying you got there and you wanted to stay for 7 years, bless you for serving our country that long, because it is kind of tough. I mean, there's very transactional culture whenever you get there versus like the relational culture that I'm sure you were used to when you were in Texas, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. It's interesting. DC is very relational, but you said it right. It's relational in a more transactional way in many cases. And, one point I want to make, Vance, about going back to the culture of DC and how it works there, how that town works is the politics of it and who's really up there fighting for the American people. One of the biggest takeaways from my time in DC is this. This is the political dynamic in Congress. When Democrats have the majority, when Democrats are in power, Democrats stay unified and they come together and they form a majority to get what Democrats want to get done, what Democrats want to get done. When Republicans are in power, Republican leadership ignores the Ted Cruzes and the Rand Pauls and the Mike Lees of the world who actually want to do what Republicans say they would like to do. Limit government, cut taxes, repeal Obamacare, right? That was a big promise of This is a great example of a battle where every Republican in 2010 and 2012 campaigned, every single one without exception, certainly in the Senate, campaigned to repeal Obamacare, to defund Obamacare. When they had the opportunity to do it, Ted Cruz and Rand Paul and Mike Lee pushed for it to happen. Republican leadership joined with a few Democrats to form a majority, blocking out their own conservative members in order to move forward.
Yep.
Right? So when Democrats are in power, they form a majority out of Democrats and push progressive policies. When Republicans are in power, they form a majority between Republicans and a few Democrats to form a majority that advances slightly less progressive policies.
It's mind-numbing. And you're exactly right. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in the House right now, right? With the speaker sort of race and Kevin McCarthy being kicked out as speaker and all the infighting that's going on. And we also see that in a lot of states. Here in Texas where I live, we're having a lot of infighting going on among just Republicans, which it's, basically a supermajority vote in both the House and the Senate, or about that in the House. It is in the Senate for sure. And all Texans or all Republicans are state offices. And there's still all the infighting that's done where they don't get the things that are actually in their GOP platform done. And this isn't meant to be a political sort of discussion right now or anything, but I think it's important to understand how the games are played, how the rent seeking takes place within the game of politics. I mean, it's just an institutional framework, just like in the marketplace, where people are trying to advocate for their rational decisions to do what? Win elections. and they've got to make sure that they win those games and those rent-seeking opportunities. Otherwise, they won't. And that's why populism, I think, has been so much on the rise, Ben, which it really worries me a lot, actually, of populism, from the Trump populism to other types of populism that are out there. It's like, okay, we'll cut your taxes and we'll increase spending at the same time. and we'll see what happens. As we know, just through theory and through evidence and everything else, and just math, that this is going to lead to deficits. You've got to cut spending and taxes at the same time, or at least restrain the growth of spending, so you don't fall into the problems that we have for decades and getting to $33 trillion in national debt, or the Kansas problem where, Brown back, they cut taxes, but they kept spending. And that's why I think what we're about to talk about a lot is really important. But I wonder what some of your thoughts are on any of that.
Man, I couldn't agree with you more. I very much sympathize with the populist movement on both sides, on the left and the right, actually. More and more, especially leaving partisan politics in DC and coming to a nonpartisan think tank in Colorado, my eyes have been more open to seeing both sides. You look back to 2008 in the global financial crisis, the left's response to that was big business, corporations, Wall Street is corrupt, and they're the problem. And what was their response? Occupy Wall Street, right? And the right's response to that was, well, big government, too much government, they're the problem. And the response that was the Tea Party movement to try to, we got the budget deal in, what was that, 2010, the 2010 budget deal that restrained the growth in government.
2011, the Budget Control Act, 2011.
The Budget Control Act, 2011.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep.
And that was sort of the right's response was, well, it's big government's fault. And what I realize now more than before is that it's really kind of both, right? The problem is big government and big business getting in bed with one another.
Yeah.
Right. And a lot of the complaints you hear from the far left are not entirely wrong. They just misdiagnose the cause, the root of the problem. And because of that, they identify the wrong solution. And what I mean by that specifically is they say, well, we have this growing wealth divide. We have all this sort of unfairness and inequity in the economy. Well, we're a capitalist country, so it must be capitalism's fault, and it must be, big business's fault. And it's like, well, yes, we do have growing wealth inequality, and we do have inequities in the economy, but the root of the problem is big government and getting in bed with big business.
Yes.
And I don't blame business. Business capital will always go where it's treated best. But it should never be the case that capital is treated best by going to Washington, D.C. and spending money on politics.
Amen. Amen, brother. This what we're talking about here, right, is corporate welfare, handouts to businesses, which typically end up being to big businesses. Small businesses don't really get these breaks with the handouts and everything else that's going on. It's really the big business that does. And oftentimes, I also feel for the right and the populist movement that's going on, saying, well, a lot of these big businesses don't have the interests of the American people anymore, that they're going after these social justice factors and everything else. And while I may not agree with some of the direction that those companies are going, I understand where these sort of populist sort of rhetoric and policy initiatives are done to try to go after those companies. But I always go back to, well, why are they doing this? Well, how are they getting set up? Are they having tax breaks? Are they getting subsidies? Let's take those away first. They shouldn't exist for anyone before you start trying to put more taxes or go after businesses for policy, because then if they can go after those businesses now, they're going to go after the other businesses whenever the new people are in town later on. And that's kind of really a big concern that I have right now.
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Both sides on the populist movement say, well, we've got this problem, so let's go after the businesses. And the truth of the matter is businesses will always find a way to operate in their own self-interest, in their best interest. Like I said, capital goes where it's treated best, right? The businesses aren't the root of the problem. If you limit the power of the government, if you make it impossible for businesses to benefit the way they do by going and knocking on DC's door, then it solves the problem. If you solve the problem by limiting government. If it's not helpful to spend millions of dollars on lobbyists in DC, then guess what? They'll put that capital to good use, growing our economy instead.
Yes. Yeah, exactly right, Ben. And we didn't even really talk about that we were going to go down this direction, but I think this is all very helpful information for the audience and for the discussion at large, because we're seeing so much of this right now, for, like you said, from the left and the right. And it's something that we've got to confront. And at the end of the day, in my view, and I think yours, is that free market capitalism is the best path to let people prosper. And we've seen that throughout recorded history. And I actually think we need to get back to capitalism. I think America has been too far towards socialism when you look at healthcare, education, transportation. You look at the commanding heights of the economy, they are dominated by government spending, meaning our taxpayer dollars are being redistributed from the productive private sector to these government entities, this government spending. And that is not an efficient allocation of resources because there's not a price signal. There's not the price signals that are allocating resources. It's government top-down approach, and that's more of a socialist system. And until we get past that, we're going to continue to run massive deficits. We're going to continue to have boom and bust cycles created by the Federal Reserve and other things. And we're going to lead to these bigger problems that we have. Before we go on to really get into the Colorado situation,
we could go on and on, Vance.
I know. Any last words about that topic, though?
No, I mean, I think you're right on. We better stop, or we'll keep talking about this stuff forever.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to something else. So the other big thing, though, Ben, you being an Independence Institute now, which is a great organization. I hope everyone goes and checks out the website and really looks at the information that y'all are providing, because it's fantastic. And you've done some great videos on this and everything else. And what I wanted to talk to you about was, TABOR, the Taxpayers Bill of Rights, passed in 1992 in Colorado and approved by the voters. So it's in the Constitution, which is great. That's really the gold standard and has been the gold standard for a fiscal rule, a spending limit for all the states. And, Texas has transformed it to something similar to that. Other states are moving in that direction. I've been trying to lead this kind of responsible or sustainable budget revolution. We've got the school choice revolution. We've got the flat tax revolution. I think we need a sustainable budget revolution is really going to underpin all this stuff. And TABOR has been weakened over time. And your research has shown this from the courts and everything else. And then there's a new thing, this Proposition HH, that's on the ballot this year, coming up soon, could make it even weaker. It could throw it out in so many ways. And so what's your take on what's going on in TABOR? Maybe give us a little bit of background, and that'll help us out with the rest of our conversation today.
Man, Vance, a lot to unpack there.
Right? I know.
Maybe some of your listeners know TABOR, some don't. TABOR, the Taxpayers Bill of Rights in Colorado's Constitution, is very unique. What it does is it says the growth in the state government, this growth in state spending, can only equal population growth and inflation, right? It says there should be some kind of a limit on how much of your money the state can take and spend for you, right?
Mm-hmm.
It says that if the state wants to spend more than that, if it wants to increase taxes or spend more than what the Constitution allows, they can, but they just have to go to voters and ask. Voters have to approve it at the ballot. So it's a very, very powerful tool. Colorado, let me start here. Politicians on both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, when they're in power, and since TABOR's been in place, Republicans have been in power and Democrats have been in power, Democrats more recently, they all hate it because neither party wants a restraint on their own power and their own spending. But more recently, Colorado has a trifecta of Democrats and Democrats that are being increasingly controlled by the progressive far left wing of their party. And their view is that there should be no limit on how much of your money the government can take and spend. They want TABOR gone. And it's in their party platform. The very first priority under taxation in their party platform is repeal TABOR. They do not want a limitation on how much of your money they can take and spend. And I'll let you take it from there, but that gets into everything else.
No, and it really does. And, TABOR started off as very strong. I mean, covered quite a bit of the budget. I think more than a majority of the budget when it started. Now I think it's down to about 35% of the total budget is what's covered. Mm-hmm. And so what that does, again, is it leaves more room for the state legislature to come in and spend more. Yes, they're limited to some capacity with population growth plus inflation, which I truly believe is the best measure to restrain the growth of spending. There's a lot of discussion about this, about what measure should we use. Personal income growth, gross state product, GDP, or gross state product divided, or government spending as a share of GDP. There's a lot of different measures that are out there. But I think population growth plus inflation is so important. I know Dan Mitchell used to be at Cato Institute and everything. He talks about it being the golden rule to where the spending limit should be less than the growth in the economy. And that's why population growth is important. Because GDP, gross domestic product, just for the audience and everything, is just the measure of the economy's output and everything else. And so some would say that government should just grow at that same level to make sure that they can fund things and everything else. And the way that I always want to look at it, though, Ben, is from the taxpayer's perspective. What can we actually afford? I don't really care what they need to appropriate for. They're going to figure that out through policies and everything else, no matter how much money they have, because as we know, they're never going to have enough for education. They're never going to have enough for healthcare and transportation. So there's got to be limits on how much money is being taken out of the productive private sector, right? And so that's where we got to have these limitations. And population growth plus inflation, just to get real technical real quick for the audience though, is GDP is measured by population growth plus inflation plus productivity. That's how you measure it. And there's one way to measure it. So is personal income, very similar. So if productivity is the only term that's different, government does not become more productive. So I can't see that being a positive over time. And so I just make it zero. And then the private sector, it's always positive or usually positive. And so if productivity is positive in the private sector, you want more money in the private sector, not in government. And so that term becomes zero. And what are you left with? Population growth plus inflation. So even from a technical perspective, not even looking at it from a average Joe sort of scenario of it's just the average measure, or it's the measure of the average taxpayer's ability to pay for government spending, but even from a technical economist or fiscal sort of perspective, it still would be the best thing to use. And that's why I think the TABOR has been so effective, even though it's been limited over time, Ben. But what are some of the other limitations that you've seen, or any sort of things that you like to respond with?
Well, I think your technical breakdown is really good. Let me try to put it in more layman's terms.
Please.
There are two conversations. There are two separate debates. One debate is the one that now we're having in Colorado with progressives, which is, should there even be a limit on the growth in government? And they say no. And I say, well, I think there should be some kind of a limit, right? The second conversation, if you agree, by the way, I think it's a radical notion to say that there should be absolutely no limitation on the growth in government and how much of your money the government spends.
Right.
The logical conclusion of that belief, if you take it to its extreme, is absolute communism, not to be hyperbolic. But if you ask a Democrat in Colorado, well, if you don't think TABOR, population growth plus inflation, is the appropriate limit, and by the way, this is the second conversation. If you agree that there should be a limit on the growth in government, then you can debate about what exactly that limit should be, and that's what you're getting at.
Yeah.
Right. If you ask a Democrat in Colorado, you say, well, if you don't like TABOR's spending limit, if you don't like population growth and inflation, then what should the limit be? They won't answer the question. And the reason why they won't answer the question is because they don't think there should be any limit.
Yep.
And that's why I say it may sound hyperbolic, but the logical conclusion of that view is absolute communism.
Yep, that's right.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, well, I was going to get into the specific sort of breaking down what you said in layman's terms. Now, the conversation of what should that limit be? Let's just assume we agree there should be some kind of a limit. Population growth plus inflation makes sense for this reason. What I say is, as the dollar loses value, it's reasonable for government to get a revenue adjustment, right, for their increased costs. And as the population grows, it's reasonable to think that the state will have more legitimate expenditures to support a larger population. But any growth beyond population and inflation in the economy is real increased per capita GDP, is real per capita wealth creation. Yeah. Right. Like real new wealth per person.
Yeah.
Right. So the question then is, when the economy creates new wealth in real terms per person, per capita, who should benefit from the new wealth in the economy? Families and taxpayers, the people working the economy, or the government, or should the government be able to siphon it all off? And I say, well, when there's real economic growth per capita, when there's real wealth creation in the economy, the people who created that wealth, working people, businesses, families, they should benefit from the wealth they created. It shouldn't be siphoned off by government.
Yeah. No, I love it. Yeah, that's a great way to put it, Ben. I like that a lot. And look, Colorado is a great state. And in fact, my wife and I talk about where else we would move, and Colorado would be one of those states for sure. We visited there over the summer. We really like Colorado a lot. And when you look at some of the other measures that are out there, and this is a report that we're going to have out pretty soon, kind of been working on this here soon, talking about the sustainable Colorado budget and some other things. But the Fraser Institute puts out this Economic Freedom of North America report, and in the latest report, Colorado ranked 21st. Texas, where I'm at, is 4th. Florida is 1st. And so Colorado's got some work to do. And it's really in the middle of the pack in a lot of different measures. When you look at migration trends, business tax climate, economic outlook. I mean, given the situation where Colorado is located, given the diversity that's there, I really think it could be the new melting pot of a place that could have more opportunities for businesses, for families, for individuals to flourish. And it's not hot. It's not as hot as Texas, and things of that nature. It's got some beautiful area around as well. And so I really think that limiting government spending and having a stronger spending limit than the current TABOR is what we're going to be, advocating for in the Sustainable Colorado budget will be so important. Because why? Because it will allow for tax rates to be cut, for income tax rates, which there's the corporate income taxes and there's the personal income taxes, but just income taxes in general, 4.4%. Get those rates down, get them down to zero at some point. And that can be done if you just limit government spending and use surpluses to buy those down. And unfortunately, with this Proposition HH that's going to be on the ballot soon, Ben, that could even revert some of the benefits that people are receiving now in kind of the checks that go out with this, the stipends that are sent out. But that would even make it even more difficult for tax cuts. So you actually have more money in your pocket, not giving it to government before you even have to get any sort of rebate checks or something else. And so what's going on with this Proposition HH as we close here today?
Yeah. So what you're getting at here is the Taxpayers Bill of Rights, TABOR, says that when the tax code as written at current tax rates, when it generates more revenue for the state than the state is allowed to keep, in other words, when it generates revenue in excess of that spending limit, the state is required to send the excess back to taxpayers as a refund, right? And
which is great. Not many states have that. I don't know if any other state right now that has that.
It's a great thing. It's a great thing, and it does what we talked about. It says that the excess economic growth that the private economy created shouldn't go to grow government. It should go to make people better, individuals and families and businesses better off. And I mean, there's a lot to this. You mentioned earlier that over time, since TABOR was passed in 1992, more and more government revenue is outside of TABOR, and that's because, without getting into the details, lawmakers and courts have created loopholes to TABOR to allow government to grow faster than TABOR intended to let it grow.
Mm-hmm.
But even that is not enough for our state government. And by the way, that's what our paper that's coming out soon is getting at is, look, if more of the state budget was restrained by TABOR, was restrained by the population growth plus inflation limit as it should be,
yeah,
then far more money would be going back to taxpayers or staying in the private economy. And we haven't been doing that. We've been getting more and more spending outside of TABOR, allowing government to grow at a much faster pace in Colorado than it ought to.
Yep.
But that's not enough for the folks in charge here in Colorado today. All that extra growth they've created by skirting TABOR isn't enough for them. The state budget, despite TABOR, the state budget has grown by 35% since 2020 because of all the revenue coming in that they've exempted from TABOR. What they're saying is that's not enough. We want to completely eliminate the TABOR cap. We want there to be no limit at all on how much money we get to keep. And in 2019, they tried that. They put Proposition CC on the ballot, and they simply asked, hey, can we keep your TABOR refunds forever? Can we just get rid of that TABOR cap? And voters said, absolutely not. They rejected the measure. It didn't work. And so this year, Governor Polis and lawmakers are following Rahm's rule. Rahm's rule is, never let a crisis go to waste.
Right.
And he clarified, by the way, people know that quote, never let a crisis go to waste. This isn't verbatim. He said, what I mean by that is you need to use a crisis to do what you couldn't do before. Okay. And what Governor Polis and the Democrats couldn't do before is persuade voters to consent to increasing or getting rid of that TABOR cap, which is an effective tax increase, right? Because that's all that money that you would have otherwise kept that's now going to government. And so what Proposition HH does is it uses a property tax crisis that we have in Colorado. Property taxes are rising 40-50% across the state from last tax year to this tax year. And our politicians, rather than just giving us property tax relief as they ought, say, ensuring that property taxes only go up 5 or 6 or 8%, instead of doing that, they're using the crisis as a new approach to getting us to consent to giving up our TABOR refunds, to lifting that TABOR cap, right? That's what Proposition HH is about, and that'll be on the ballot in Colorado this November. And we are fighting that tooth and nail. Now, HH would give you a slight reduction in the increase in property taxes. So say the county assessor in Douglas County, one of our biggest counties, told me recently, he said, I've estimated that the average increase in property tax will be 43%. If Polis's plan, Proposition HH passes, the average increase in my county will be 39% instead. Still a historic increase in property taxes. Again, they're not really trying to give you property tax relief. They're using this crisis because in the fine print of Proposition HH, you're giving up your TABOR refunds. It drastically increases that TABOR cap.
Yeah.
Funneling tens of billions of dollars more to grow state government over the coming decades.
Wow. Well, I know that there's a lot of interest in this and across the nation, across the country, because of the work that you've been doing, and Independence Institute's been doing, and the benefits of TABOR over time. When you talk about Barry Paulson, who helped with the creation of that, he's one of my mentors in this area, and really got me interested in responsible budgeting, spending limits, and everything else, because I do think that it is one of the most important things that we've got to have for government is to put restraints on what politicians can do. Milton Friedman said, don't judge a policy by its intentions, but by its results. And we've got to look at what the government spending is out there. But also he said that the ultimate burden of government is not the revenue, but it's the spending. The spending is the ultimate burden, because if you didn't spend it, you don't have to tax it. And if you didn't spend it, you couldn't regulate it because you don't have a bureaucracy to regulate things on. So we allow for the economy, private economy, people to act and flourish together and come together in a marketplace, which is a beautiful thing. And I think we need more of that. And so I applaud your efforts there. I hope this Proposition HH fails. It should fail, and that there should be better opportunities like what we're coming out with our Sustainable Colorado budget here soon, of looking at limiting government spending, providing income tax relief, or just across corporate income and personal income, and really providing more opportunities for people to flourish in Colorado. So I think you're on the right track, Ben. Keep that stuff going. Any last words for the audience before we shut down today?
No, I mean, I just appreciate you doing the work you're doing, not just here in Colorado, helping us look at this budget stuff, but I know you're working in Texas and Louisiana and across the country. You're spot on. We've got to control government spending. We've got to control the growth in government if we're going to, as you say, let people prosper.
Yeah. Well, amen, brother. Well, I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you though, Ben. God bless you and your family. And I hope to have you on it again sometime.
All right. Thanks, Vance.
All right. And for the audience, if you liked our conversation, please leave us a 5-star rating and subscribe wherever you get this podcast. You can also check out all the show notes at vanceginn.com. Until next time, let people prosper.